He should never have lived, not adrift in open water, not strapped to a ruined surfboard, not at barely 3 months old. Yet there he was, washed in salt, starved thin, eyelids swollen, drifting 1,000 feet off the Jacksonville coast. And somehow, against all logic, help found him. Not just the kind born of rank and protocol, but the kind that carries redemption in its wake. What you're about to hear isn't merely the account of 3 puppies thrown aside like waste. It's the story of who they became, and who they would someday save. This tale may break your heart in one breath and rebuild it in the next. But before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Type your city or country below. And if you believe in second chances, in miracles with fur and beating hearts, hit subscribe. The ocean didn't claim them, and neither will the world. The first light of morning slid over Jacksonville, Florida in a muted sweep of pale silver. The Atlantic was deceptively gentle, the kind of calm seasoned sailors never trusted. A soft veil of fog hovered low over the surface, and the only sound breaking the silence was the steady churn of a Navy Zodiac patrol boat as it cut slowly through the glassy water. From the deck, the shoreline was little more than a faint charcoal smudge. Standing at the bow was Gunnery Sergeant Mason Ridge, broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, carved from years of salt air and long deployments. At 38, his skin bore the bronze of countless days at sea, and his iron-blue eyes carried the weary sharpness of a man who'd spent too many dawns waiting for storms both real and personal. One storm, though, he had never outrun. The one that claimed his younger brother, Caleb, 25 years earlier. Mason never spoke of that day at Lake Allatoona. A family outing, laughter on the shore, then a current that moved faster than a boy's legs. Mason had been 13, old enough to swim, not fast enough to save him. He had heard his mother scream a second too late. And that second had carved something permanent in him, a silent vow never to freeze again when a life depended on him. Beside him crouched Petty Officer First Class Ramirez, balancing herself against the edge with practiced ease. She was wiry, quiet, late 30s, skin sun-darkened and hair clipped short enough that the wind couldn't bother it. Ramirez never wasted words. Mason trusted her precisely for that reason. Anything? Mason asked, eyes narrowing at the fog. Ramirez adjusted her binoculars. Nothing but, hold on. Her voice dipped sharply. Mason straightened. Ramirez leaned forward, tightening the focus. There's something white. Floating. Looks like a busted surfboard. Mason frowned. Out here. The Zodiac glided closer as he raised his own binoculars. At first, it looked like driftwood, worn, waterlogged, listing in the current. Then it shifted, just slightly. And he saw shapes. Small ones. 3 of them. What in, Ramirez, are those? Puppies, she finished, her voice tight. Those are puppies. Mason's jaw locked. He slapped the radio on his vest. Rescue 1 to command, unknown debris with live animals approximately 1,000 feet offshore. Request immediate clearance for retrieval. Static crackled. Copy, Rescue 1. Proceed. Line stays open. Ramirez was already hauling out netting and gloves. Closing in. The Zodiac nudged forward through the soft swells. As the fog thinned, the scene came into brutal clarity. 3 German Shepherd puppies, no older than 4 months, drenched and trembling atop the wrecked surfboard. Ropes were tied around their tiny bodies and fastened to the board, as if someone had meant for the ocean to finish the job. The largest pup lifted its head with a weak twitch of an ear. The other 2 didn't move. Jesus, Mason muttered. Ramirez leaned over the side. Going in. Negative, Mason snapped. We pull them up from here. With steady precision, Ramirez cast the net beneath the board and drew it toward the side of the boat. The pups offered no struggle, too cold, too exhausted, too close to slipping away. Mason reached down with a towel, his chest tightening as he got a closer look. Their paws were rubbed raw, pads cracked, ribs sharp beneath matted fur. One pup's breathing was so faint it barely stirred its chest. He lifted the largest pup first. It didn't whine or squirm, just pressed weakly into his arms like warmth was the only thing it still recognized. The second pup shivered violently, eyes dull, unfocused. The third was limp. Ramirez checked its pulse with 2 fingers. Got one, barely. We need to move. Mason wrapped each puppy in towels and blankets. His voice sharpened. Straight back to base. Tell them we're coming in hot, get the emergency vet unit ready. Ramirez relayed the orders as the Zodiac spun and accelerated toward shore. Behind them, the sun began to burn away the fog, turning the water gold. But Mason saw none of it. All he saw was Caleb, 12 years old, hair plastered to his forehead, slipping beneath the surface while Mason screamed. These pups, so small, so disposable to someone, dragged that memory up from the deep like an anchor. Mason looked down at the largest pup curled in his arms, breaths shallow and uneven. He didn't know their names, or where they came from. But he knew one thing. They would not die today. Not in his arms. Not on his watch. The Zodiac's engine droned low as it sped toward the naval pier, slicing through the brightening water. The breeze had shifted since dawn, carrying sharper salt and a rising wind. Mason Ridge knelt near the aft section, bracing himself against the boat's vibrations while cradling the 3 bundled puppies. Their fur was still soaked and stuck to their fragile frames, their breathing shallow, their limbs twitching every few seconds as if their bodies were fighting to stay awake. Each movement sent a jolt through Mason's chest. Ramirez crouched beside him, one hand lightly pressed to the smallest pup's ribs. Her brows knitted together. Still shallow, she murmured. But he's hanging on. At the helm, Ensign Daniel Torres guided the Zodiac with a seriousness that was rare for him. At 24, he was known on base for his crooked grin and easy humor, always ready with a joke when one wasn't needed. But not now. His knuckles were bone white on the wheel, jaw working as he pushed the engine for every knot of speed. For minutes out, Torres called, voice uncharacteristically tight. Mason didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the largest pup, the only one who had shown any sign of awareness earlier. Now the little dog's eyes were half open, dull, barely tracking movement. The smallest pup trembled again, spasms passing through its tiny body like shock waves. The middle pup still didn't move at all. As they approached the dock, a small team waited, medical personnel from the base, but foremost among them stood Private First Class Jasmine Jazz Holloway, the volunteer veterinary technician assigned to the animal care trailer. She wore a gray hoodie under her uniform vest, sleeves pushed up, gloves already pulled on. A long honey blonde braid spilled down her back, frayed at the edges from a long shift. Her face, freckled, warm, grounded, held a steady focus that rarely cracked. She moved toward the boat with controlled urgency. Bring them straight in, she called. 3 trauma beds prepped. Heating pads ready. 4 fluids warming. Mason scooped up the heaviest puppy, no more than 7 pounds but feeling like a weight on his soul. He looked at Jazz, an unspoken question flickering in his eyes. I've got them, she said softly but firmly. Inside the trailer, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets. It was cramped but functional, stainless steel counters, drawers stacked with supplies, and 3 small thermal pads laid out on the examination table. Jazz set down the first pup and immediately swept a stethoscope across its chest. Severe hypothermia. Shallow respiration. Salt irritation in the eyes. Let's flush them. Ramirez, grab the lactated ringers and the 22s. Ramirez moved quickly, rifling through the top drawer. Jazz leaned in over the smallest pup, the one Mason feared might already be gone. Come on, sweetheart, she whispered, fingers searching for the tiny femoral pulse. Come on. Give me something. They're faint, but real. She brought her cheek close to the pup's muzzle. The breath was cold against her skin. Too cold. Jazz didn't hesitate. She began compressions, small, precise, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Mason stood frozen near the door, his world narrowing to the sound of Jazz's steady counting. Without looking up, she snapped, "If you're going to stand there, make yourself useful. Grab that towel and start massaging his limbs. We need blood flow back." Mason blinked, snapped out of his shock. He knelt, wrapping the pup in soft fleece, rubbing gently along its spine and down to its paws. The tiny dog was frighteningly still. Ramirez returned with a syringe. "Flush ready." Jazz flushed the second pup's eyes. It whined in pain, proof it was still fighting. The smallest pup made no noise. Her hand slowed. She paused. Then, there. A faint gasp. A tiny rise of the chest. Jazz exhaled shakily, her eyes glassy but focused. "That's it. That's it, baby. Stay with me." Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He rested his head briefly against the wall, silently thanking whatever force brought them to that floating board. 20 minutes later, the three puppies lay side by side under warm blankets, for drips humming quietly. Their paws had been bandaged. Their bodies cleaned. Their breath steadier. Jazz sat cross-legged on the floor close enough to reach them if they stirred. She wasn't budging. "They're going to pull through," she said quietly, brushing a strand of damp fur from the smallest pup's eyebrow. "They've been through hell, but they're fighters." Mason nodded once. "I could tell." Jazz's gaze drifted to the rope burns across their tiny torsos. They didn't drift out there by accident. Someone tied them to that board. Mason's jaw tightened. "Yeah. I saw." A heavy silence fell across the trailer, broken only by the soft beep of monitors and the whisper of oxygen tubes. Jazz's hand hovered over the largest pup's head as if reassuring both herself and the dog. "I'm staying here tonight," she said. "If they wake up alone, they'll panic." "I'll be back in 2 hours," Mason replied, checking his watch. "Got to file the report. I'll check in before sunset." She nodded without looking up. "Thank you, for bringing them back." He paused at the door, the flap rustling with the wind. "I didn't bring them back," Mason said, his voice dropping to something almost fragile. "They brought me back." Then he stepped out into the fading light. Left alone, Jazz curled onto the floor beside the small row of beds. Her head rested lightly against the cabinet, her fingers brushing the smallest pup's back. 3 little souls thrown away like nothing. Not anymore. Not while she was breathing. By late afternoon, the sun over Jacksonville had begun its slow slide downward, stretching long amber streaks across the Navy base. Inside the modest animal clinic behind the southern barracks, the 3 German Shepherd puppies slept soundly beneath warmed blankets. 4 lines dripped steadily beside them, their small bodies rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Jazz Holloway had not moved more than a few feet from their side since the rescue. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid that had frayed through the hours, her hoodie smudged from leaning against kennels and cabinets. She'd eaten half a granola bar and drunk 2 sips of water in the last 12 hours, but her focus was razor sharp. She sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the metal cabinet, clipboard balanced on her knee. The paper in front of her wasn't an official chart, she'd completed those hours ago. This was something else. Observations. Thoughts. Small notes she didn't want to lose. The largest pup moved first. He blinked slowly, the heavy fog in his eyes beginning to thin. For the first time since morning, his gaze tracked the space around him. He inhaled deeper. He shifted slightly under his blanket. Jazz watched him with a kind of quiet awe. "You're the one who held on," she whispered. "Stubborn little fighter. He didn't wag his tail or lift his ears. He simply looked at her, still and steady, as if measuring the room with instincts older than his age. There was a hardness in his stillness, something forged in survival. Jazz reached out and brushed her fingers along his paw. "Breaker," she murmured. "That's your name." To her, names were lifelines, anchors to identity. After growing up as a rotating case number in the Georgia foster system, she understood what it meant to exist without a name that stayed. She moved to the smallest pup next, the one who had hovered closest to death. Earlier, she had trembled at even the faintest touch. Now, she lay curled on her side, breathing softly, her fur dusted in tan and faint gold. Jazz bent close, brushing a fingertip along the pup's tiny ear. "You're Coral," she whispered. "Soft on the surface. Strong underneath." Then there was the last one, the scrappy, restless middle pup. Even with bandaged paws and an 4-line taped to his foreleg, he was already trying to gnaw the corner of his blanket. He huffed and wriggled with a spark of defiance, eyes darting around as though plotting an escape. Jazz chuckled softly. "You little trouble starter," she said. "Riptide fits you. Always fighting the current." As she finished noting the names on her unofficial list, a shadow filled the doorway. Mason Ridge stepped inside, still in uniform, boots dusty from a long afternoon in the field. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, solid, quiet, the kind of presence you didn't have to hear to feel. Breaker lifted his head a fraction, sensing him immediately. Coral stilled, her breathing becoming gentle and even. Even Riptide momentarily paused his chewing. "You're back," Jazz said, adjusting Riptide's 4 regulator. "I said I would be." He crouched beside Breaker's kennel. "How's he doing?" "They all made it past the critical point," Jazz replied. "They're stable." Mason nodded, his eyes still locked on Breaker. The pup shifted, nose pushing out from the blanket. Mason reached his hand through the bars, holding it still. Slowly, Breaker leaned forward until his forehead rested against Mason's fingers. Mason's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. "You named them yet?" he asked, voice low. Jazz smiled faintly. "Breaker. Coral. And Riptide." A soft huff of amusement escaped him. "Those fit." He pulled up a plastic stool and sat beside the nearest kennel. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Jazz continued scribbling notes. Mason watched the pups as though committing every breath to memory. Finally, in a quiet voice meant more for the room than for Jazz, Mason said, "Caleb would have loved them." She didn't interrupt. "He was the fast one," Mason continued. "Always rushing ahead. I was the kid who insisted on triple-checking knots before we launched a canoe. He'd jump in first, no hesitation." Jazz slid her clipboard aside, listening. "When he went under," Mason said, staring at Coral now, "I thought maybe if I had yelled sooner, or swam faster." "The ocean doesn't care about voices," Jazz said softly. "Or memories." Mason turned his head. "What does it care about then?" "Maybe the way people come back," she said. "Or the way someone keeps moving forward even when the water's cold." Mason didn't speak, but the rigid set of his shoulders softened. That night, Jazz made a call to Brave Haven Shelter, one of the Navy's trusted partners for rescued animals. The shelter's director, Darla Winslow, was a retired combat medic known for 2 things, a gravel-rough voice and a heart big enough to fill a ship. "I've got 3 shepherd pups," Jazz said. "They've been through hell, but they're fighters." Darla didn't hesitate. "Bring them. I'll prep the quiet room. And tell whoever found them they're getting free coffee for a month." Before dawn, Jazz loaded the 3 puppies, each wrapped in towels, into a Navy transport van. Mason stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "You don't have to come," Jazz said. "I know," he replied, opening the passenger door. "Let's go." Brave Haven sat just beyond the city limits, surrounded by pine scrub and hanging moss. A sign stood outside. Brave Haven Shelter. Where survivors rest and rise. Darla met them at the gate, clipboard in one hand, thermos in the other. "Well, aren't you three a sight?" she rasped as she peered into the crates. "Come on. Warm beds, food, and a room away from the rowdy bunch." Inside, the shelter didn't feel like a clinic, it felt like a home. Soft lights. Wooden kennels. Calming music humming low. Jazz opened Breaker's crate first. He blinked at her, eyes clearer now. "You're safe here," she whispered. Coral took one tentative step onto the polished floor. Riptide bounded out, straight into Mason's boot, glaring at it like the boot had wronged him. For the first time that day, Mason laughed, just a breath, but real. Jazz smiled as Riptide bumped her knee and whined. "They're already choosing their people." Mason knelt and scratched behind Riptide's ear. "Easy, lightning bolt." Breaker lifted his head and looked at both of them, his gaze steady and knowing. Something had shifted, and they all felt it. Night settled early over Jacksonville that week, the clouds heavy and low, the sky dimming to charcoal long before the clocks marked evening. At Brave Haven Shelter, the hallway lights softened to a warm amber glow, stretching quiet shadows across the reclaimed wood floors. Outside, the wind combed through the pine trees in slow, restless breaths. Inside, the shelter felt like a place suspended between pain and healing, restful, but not quite peaceful yet. Mason Ridge sat on the floor beside Breaker's kennel, one arm draped over a folded blanket, his back resting against the wooden wall. He hadn't planned on staying again. He never did. But every time he tried to drive home, something tugged him back. His truck would somehow find itself circling the block, easing into the same parking spot near the back entrance. He didn't even bother knocking anymore. Darla had long given up trying to make him. And Jazz, she always left the door cracked. Breaker lay curled in the corner of his kennel, twitching faintly under the soft fleece blanket Jazz had placed over him. His breathing was too quick, his legs kicking in small, frantic bursts. Then came the sound, the tiny, strained whimper that built into a sharp yelp, the kind that came from more than pain. It came from memory. Mason slid open the kennel's gate and reached inside. He rested a hand on the pup's ribcage, gentle and grounding. "You're not out there anymore," he whispered. "You're here. You're safe." Breaker twitched again, then slowly calmed, the tension leaving his limbs one breath at a time. He let out a long, shuddered sigh, the kind that sounded like the tail end of a nightmare breaking apart. Mason stayed like that for minutes. Maybe longer. He didn't check. Down the hall, Coral lay in a quiet kennel softened with fleece blankets and a tiny diffuser that released a gentle lavender scent. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Every feeding bowl Jazz replaced stayed almost untouched. The little pup only moved when a hand brushed her fur, and even then, she did no more than flinch. Jazz sat cross-legged beside Coral's space, humming softly. Her voice was cracked from exhaustion, hoarse from lack of sleep, but steady in that way only she knew how to be. She watched Coral with quiet patience, her gaze tender but waited. "It's yours," she whispered. "No one can take it. No one's leaving you." Coral lifted her head, sniffed, and then curled tighter into herself. A few kennels down, Riptide paced, and paced, and paced. His paws clicked rhythmically on the floor like a metronome that couldn't settle. He didn't whine. Didn't bark. Just moved in a fixed loop, scanning the corners like he expected the walls to close in. With the salt and dirt washed from his coat, the thin scar along his back stood out sharper, curving like a question mark across his spine. Mason rose from Breaker's side and walked to Riptide's kennel. He crouched low, watching the pup complete 2 full loops before gently unlatching the gate. "Come here, you little sparkplug," Mason murmured. Riptide froze mid-step, turned, and stared at him, tense, curious, not ready to trust but not ready to run. Mason sat, elbows on his knees, and waited. A soft shuffle of socks on wood announced Jazz's arrival. She approached, a steaming mug cupped between both hands. Her hoodie sleeves were bunched at her elbows, and she looked like she was held together by caffeine and sheer will. She sank down beside Mason with a quiet groan. "He's been walking since 8, she murmured. "Breaker's still fighting ghosts," Mason said. "Coral still won't eat. And he," Mason nodded toward Riptide, "is trying to outpace his own shadow." Jazz let out a tired breath. "Remind me why this doesn't feel hopeless." Mason didn't answer at first. Then he turned his head slightly. "Because we're still here." Jazz leaned back against the wall, mug warming her hands. Silence filled the hallway, thick and still. "When I was 10, she said suddenly, voice flat, there was this couple. They came to the group home. Said they were ready to adopt a little girl." Mason turned toward her. "They sat with me for hours," Jazz continued. "She let me braid her scarf. He said I could help plant a garden in their backyard. I thought that was it. That was the day." Her smile flickered, thin, brittle. "I packed everything I owned. One grocery bag. Waited by the door for hours. Thought they went to get the car." She paused. "They never came back." Mason's expression tightened. He didn't speak. "I didn't eat for 3 days, Jazz whispered. I just watched the door." Mason's jaw tensed. He didn't try to fix it. He just let her words settle. After a moment, he exhaled. "I almost left the Navy a few years ago." Jazz blinked. "You?" "I couldn't get back in the water." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Training op off Okinawa. Strong current caught a diver. Good man. Skilled. Calm. And he swallowed. I froze." "You blame yourself," she said softly. "I still do." Riptide had stopped pacing now. He lay near the gate, watching both of them as if trying to read their breaths. "Sometimes I think these pups are carrying things I never figured out how to let go of," Mason murmured. Jazz reached over, briefly touching Mason's wrist, just a moment of human grounding. "A tether." A rough voice cut through the hallway. "I thought you two clocked out at midnight." Darla Winslow appeared, wearing her oversized flannel, boots unlaced, hair in a wild ponytail. Her arms crossed, but her grin unmistakable. "You look like 2 people who got hit by a truck full of guilt and dog hair." Jazz snorted. "That's pretty accurate." Darla knelt by Coral, stroking the pup's side. Coral didn't move away. "She'll eat," Darla said. "When she believes the food won't disappear." Mason raised a brow. Jazz sighed in agreement. "You staying again?" Darla asked. "Yeah," they both said. "Then get yourselves blankets before your spines fuse with my floor." She left with a smirk and the faint scent of menthol trailing behind her. That night, Jazz curled onto a sleeping bag between the kennels. Mason pulled a blanket to the floor near Riptide's enclosure. The dog stayed quiet, but something shifted. Breaker twitched only once before settling. Coral nudged her bowl half an inch closer. Riptide pressed his scarred shoulder lightly against the gate, eyes finally closing. Jazz whispered into the dim, "They're still scared." Mason said nothing. Instead, he dragged his blanket a little closer to their kennels, his own silent promise. In that quiet room, 3 animals once cast to the sea began to sleep. Not fully at peace yet, but differently. Not forgotten. Not alone. Morning arrived quietly, as though it didn't want to disturb the fragile calm inside Brave Haven shelter. The early spring light drifted through the east-facing windows in soft golden stripes, warming the edges of the kennels. Outside, the air carried a crisp saltiness, a scent that whispered of tides shifting and seasons changing. Jazz Holloway had been awake long before dawn. Not because she needed to be, no alarms buzzed, no emergencies flared, but because she felt something stirring, a sense that the day was ready to turn a corner. She moved through the recovery wing with slow, deliberate care, refilling water bowls, straightening fleece blankets, checking each four-line out of habit even though the drips had been removed hours ago. Her braid was frayed from sleep, her hoodie rumpled, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in days. She crouched beside Breaker's kennel first. He was awake, not just barely conscious, but fully present. His ears twitched at her approach, nose lifting as he tested the air. Then, with a trembling determination, he tried to stand. Jazz froze. His legs quivered like they weren't sure they remembered the job, but he pushed through the instinct to collapse. One paw planted. Then another. His ribs tightened with effort, but he never looked away from the open gate. "Breaker," Jazz whispered, hand rising instinctively to her chest. "You're standing." From the doorway, a low voice responded, more like trying to. Mason Ridge leaned against the frame, arms folded. His hair was still damp from a rushed shower, and his uniform looked like it had been pulled on in the dark. In his hand was a dented stainless steel travel mug, his old companion. Jazz shot him a grin. "I'll take it." Breaker took a small step forward. Then another. His back legs wobbled but held. When he reached the gate, he looked up, recognition shining through exhaustion. Mason set his mug on the table, stepped forward, and knelt. He opened the kennel slowly. "Come on," he murmured. Breaker hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping out. He managed 2 wobbly strides before his back legs slipped. Mason caught him just in time, scooping him carefully into his lap. Breaker let out a tired, broken sigh and buried his face into Mason's shoulder. Jazz's smile softened. At the next kennel, Coral stirred. Jazz moved beside her, kneeling gently. Coral lay curled in a nest of fleece and plush sea-themed toys, a little octopus, a starfish, a stingray. Her tiny head lifted, eyes warm but cautious. Jazz reached in with slow care. Coral leaned forward and, soft as a feather, licked Jazz's hand. The gesture was so gentle, so pure, that it cracked something open inside Jazz. Her throat tightened. She blinked fast, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. "Good girl," she whispered. "Good, brave girl." In the far corner, Riptide sat in a patch of sunlight, his posture sharp and alert. The scar along his back had faded enough for new fur to sprout, creating a crooked silver streak. He was staring intently at the rectangle of sunshine shifting on the wood floor. He crouched. Pounced. Missed. Barked once. Then pounced again. Jazz and Mason shared a laugh, real, warm, unrestrained. "Energy's back," Mason said lightly. Jazz nodded. "Along with the attitude." She hesitated, her fingers flexing nervously. "I've been thinking." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Should I worry?" She nudged his boot with hers. "Shut up. I think we should take them to the beach." He froze. "No. Mason. They're not ready," he insisted, voice firm. "They need it," Jazz countered. "Jazz, that shoreline is where someone tried to kill them. They don't need trauma shoved in their faces." "It wouldn't be trauma," she answered, her tone softening. "It would be reclaiming something." He shook his head. "You don't walk someone back into the fire while the burn is still fresh." She looked down at Coral, who now lay with her chin on the blanket, eyes curious rather than fearful. "Sometimes," Jazz whispered, "people walk into the smoke because someone is beside them." Mason's jaw tightened. His eyes drifted toward Riptide, who was now battling the sunlight like it was alive. "When I finally made myself go back into the water," Mason said quietly, "I nearly collapsed. I thought I could push through it. But the moment the waves touched my legs, everything locked up. My lungs. My knees. Everything. Jazz didn't interrupt. But someone stood next to me, he continued. Didn't say a word. Just stood there until I remembered I wasn't back in that lake. Jazz gently touched his hand and squeezed. They don't have words, Mason. But they feel. They trust. And they remember who showed up. He looked at her. Really looked. And the fight in his expression slowly faded. The decision was made, not in a dramatic moment, but in a quiet exhale neither of them acknowledged out loud. That afternoon, Darla helped load the van. She handed Jazz 3 new harnesses and matching lightweight leashes. Bring them all back, Darla said, narrowing her eyes. Preferably without half the beach stuck to them. Mason drove. Jazz sat in the back with the pups, Breaker curled against her leg, Coral tucked to her chest, Riptide standing proudly on her lap like he was leading the mission. They chose a quiet stretch of beach south of the base, no crowds, no noise, just dunes and horizon. Jazz carried Coral out gently. Mason lifted Breaker with the sling supporting his hind legs. Riptide hopped from the van, only to immediately freeze as the sand shifted under his paws. All 3 puppies stood still, sniffing the air. The breeze pulled at their fur. The ocean hummed in slow, steady breaths. Breaker took the lead, one careful paw pressed into damp sand. Then another. Coral watched him from the safety of Jazz's arms. Riptide crept forward with exaggerated caution, ears pricked. Then they all saw the water. Breaker hesitated but didn't retreat. He sat, shoulders steady. Waiting. Jazz set Coral down beside him. The little pup wobbled, then straightened. She took a single step toward Breaker. Riptide didn't move. His entire body went rigid, eyes wide. Mason knelt. You don't have to go in, he murmured. Just stand with us. Riptide trembled, fear battling instinct. Then he looked up, saw Breaker and Coral sitting together in the wind. And walked to them. Side by side, the 3 puppies faced the ocean, not in panic, not in pain, but in fragile courage. Alive. Together. Becoming something new. The morning air hovered cool above the shoreline, tinged with the briny breath of the Atlantic. A thin mist clung to the dunes, drifting like memory across the sand. The beach was nearly empty, just a few gulls gliding overhead and 3 faint sets of pawprints pressed into the damp earth. Mason Ridge stood barefoot behind the trio of young German shepherds, his boots resting in the sand behind him. Jazz Holloway crouched a few feet away, hoodie zipped up to her chin, fingers idly twisting the string as she watched Coral's small ears flap in the breeze. It was the puppy's second beach visit. The first had been quiet, tentative, cautious. This morning felt different. Charged. Restless. Alive. Breaker stood firm at the front, eyes fixed on the waves. His paw lifted slightly with each hiss of the tide. Coral tucked herself behind him for shelter, her delicate body trembling but her eyes wide and curious. Riptide, meanwhile, carved erratic zigzags behind his siblings, pacing quick and sharp, occasionally stopping to stare intensely at the sea before resuming his frantic loop. Mason watched Breaker's stiff posture. He's remembering, he said quietly. Maybe, Jazz replied. Or maybe he's choosing. They let the silence stretch. The wind brushed their faces, cool and salty. The ocean reached forward in gentle intervals. Then Breaker moved, one step closer to the water. Then another. The next wave rolled in, brushing against his paws. He flinched but didn't retreat. Jazz placed a hand on Coral's side. Just watch him, sweetheart. Breaker turned and looked back at his siblings, eyes steady, body grounded. Coral inched forward, each movement precise and tentative. When the water skimmed over her toes, she froze. Her small body shook. She pressed lightly into Jazz's leg. And the trembling eased. Near the dune line, Riptide had stopped pacing. His little chest rose and fell rapidly, his gaze locked on the surf as though the water were a living thing. Jazz called softly, "It's okay, Rip." He barked once, high, sharp, afraid. Mason knelt down, keeping his movements slow. He extended a hand. "It's your beach now," he whispered. "No one's going to take it from you." Riptide's growl was soft, uncertain. But he didn't run. He took 2 hesitant steps forward. Then stopped. He was trembling, but still trying. And then, a scream tore across the sand. A child's scream. Sharp. Terrified. Mason's heart lurched. Jazz bolted upright. They spun toward the jetty, dark rocks jutting into the rising tide. A small boy, 5, maybe 6, thrashed in the water near the base of the rocks. The current wrapped around him like a serpent, pulling him under every few seconds as he clawed at the waves. There was nobody else on the beach. "Mason!" Jazz shouted. But Mason was already moving, knees digging into the sand, muscles coiled. Only Breaker got there first. The German Shepherd pup launched forward like a shot, tearing across the sand in a blur of tan and black. His paws kicked up a spray behind him as he sprinted toward the water. "Breaker!" Mason's shout was lost to the wind. The pup didn't slow. He hit the surf at full speed, plunging into the shallow waves. For a moment his small head bobbed in the churn, but then he swam, strong and precise, front paws cutting in rhythmic arcs. Mason stared, stunned for a moment, long enough to remember another boy in another body of water. Then he sprinted after them. Breaker reached the child just as the boy began to sink. Without hesitation, the pup dove under the foam, clamped onto the back of the child's shirt, and twisted himself around, turning the boy toward shore. The current surged, dragging them sideways. Breaker struggled but didn't let go. He paddled fiercely, teeth locked into fabric, fighting the water that wanted to take the boy under. Mason hit the water seconds later, boots abandoned behind him. He broke through the surf in a flash of spray, grabbed the boy under the arms, and seized Breaker's harness with his other hand. Together, man and pup, they pushed against the tide, moving in sync, inching toward shore. Jazz ran out to meet them, scooping the boy into her arms the moment they hit the sand. He was coughing, gasping, sobbing, but breathing. Breaker collapsed in the wet sand, chest heaving, tongue hanging limp from exhaustion. Jazz held the boy tight. "You're okay. You're okay. You're safe." The child's father came sprinting from behind the dunes, face pale with terror. "Liam," he cried, nearly collapsing as he grabbed his son. I turned away for 1 second. Jazz nodded toward Breaker. "He's the reason your boy is alive." The man looked down at the drenched, trembling puppy. His voice cracked. "Oh my God, that dog, he saved him." Mason knelt beside Breaker, running his hands gently over the pup's damp fur. "He didn't wait for a command," Mason murmured. "He just knew." Darla arrived a few minutes later, climbing out of her truck barefoot and wearing a flannel shirt that looked older than half the base. Her hair was a wild silver tangle in the wind. She surveyed the scene, the panting dog, the crying child, the frantic father. "Well, hell," she said. "Looks like someone just earned himself a medal." The father tried to offer money. Jazz shook her head. Mason refused it outright. Instead, Jazz handed the man a Brave Haven flyer. "Tell people what he did today," she said. As the sun climbed, the mist dissolved and the shoreline brightened. Coral and Riptide ventured closer to the water, sniffing at the foam with far less fear than before. Breaker lay at Mason's feet, worn out but alert. Mason rested a hand on the pup's back, pride warming his expression. "You made a choice today," Mason murmured. "You didn't choose fear." He brushed his fingers along Breaker's harness, still soaked with seawater. "You chose purpose." And that choice would change everything. The days that followed felt like watching storms turn into seasons, slow, deliberate, and full of quiet transformation. Brave Haven buzzed with a new kind of energy, one that spread through every hallway and spilled into every tucked-away corner of the shelter. The story of the beach rescue had already made its way through the community. By midweek, Darla had answered 14 phone calls, waved away 3 news crews, and scolded 2 overeager bloggers who tried sneaking in through the back entrance. "This is a shelter, not a circus," she barked at them, sending the pair scrambling back to their cars. But even her sternness couldn't block out the warmth swelling in the building. Volunteers brought extra blankets. A retired Navy vet dropped off homemade biscuits shaped like little life vests. Kids from a school across town mailed in crayon drawings of Breaker with a superhero cape. Breaker became the center of attention, though he never sought it. The large German Shepherd pup took the praise with an almost solemn composure, his amber eyes still carrying the depth of the sea. He limped less now, his back legs strengthening day by day. The scarred memory of the ocean was slowly rewriting itself each time he pressed his paws into the sand during therapy walks. Coral's transformation was quieter but just as powerful. She had begun to eat full meals, her tiny body filling out, her ears perked with curiosity rather than fear. She followed Jazz everywhere, like a shadow stitched to her footsteps. Even during staff meetings, Coral would wedge herself under Jazz's chair, occasionally nosing her ankle just to make sure she was still there. Riptide, however, had taken on an entirely different challenge. He had become the inventor of chaos. He managed to chew through 2 leash clips, escape a playpen twice, and push open a laundry room door with the enthusiasm of a burglar looking for gold. Darla caught him dragging a feather duster down the hall like it was contraband. "This one's got opinions," she muttered, picking up the scattered cleaning supplies he'd knocked over. Yet it was Riptide who remained closest to Mason. Each time the Marine walked through the door, the pup bolted straight toward him, not with the confidence of a dog who'd chosen a favorite human, but with the relief of a soldier recognizing someone who understood the language of scars. One afternoon, Mason arrived early for the puppies' training session. Jazz looked up from the supply cabinet she was organizing. "You're here before me," she teased. "This is a first." Mason rolled his eyes. Traffic was light. Jazz smirked. "You live 6 minutes away." "Exactly." "And traffic was light," he repeated stubbornly. She tossed him a training rope. "Fine, Lieutenant Literal." Mason moved to the center of the room, Breaker limping after him with steady progress. Coral followed Jazz to the opposite side, tail flicking shyly. Riptide sat near the wall like a coil ready to spring. Jazz clapped her hands softly. "Okay, team. Today we're trying something different. Tracking drills, basic foundation work." Mason raised a brow. "They're barely healed. Isn't this too soon?" "Not intense tracking," she replied. "Just letting them identify scent patterns with encouragement. Low pressure. No expectations." Breaker straightened, alert. Coral leaned into Jazz, watching her closely. Riptide stared at Mason as if announcing, "I am ready to excel and also steal something." Jazz set up a short scent trail using a piece of rope and a small pouch dipped in mild, dog-safe odor markers. She placed it behind a few kennels, then gestured for Breaker to step forward. Mason knelt beside the pup. "You got this, buddy." Breaker sniffed the rope, then lifted his head slightly, nose twitching, ears angling like 2 radar dishes. He took 3 slow steps, paused, recalibrated, then followed the trail with a careful determination that made Mason's chest tighten. He completed the simple pattern, touched his nose to the pouch, and looked back at Mason as if asking, "Did I do it?" Mason smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face. "Yeah," he murmured. "You did." Coral was next. Jazz crouched beside her, speaking softly. "No rush. Just try." Coral sniffed the rope uncertainly. Her body trembled at first, but Jazz's steady presence anchored her. After a moment, Coral stepped forward, tiny paws patting lightly across the floor. She moved slow, with careful precision, following the scent path almost exactly. Jazz felt her throat tighten. "Good girl," she whispered. "You're brilliant." Riptide's turn was different. Jazz barely reset the rope before he bolted forward, overshooting the trail entirely, skidding across the floor, and crashing into a bin of toys with a spectacular thud. Mason covered his mouth to hide a laugh. "He's enthusiastic." Riptide emerged from the pile with a squeaky toy in his mouth and zero regrets. Darla, passing through with a stack of donated blankets, shouted, "If he destroys one more mop bucket, I'm sending you the bill." Riptide wagged his tail defiantly. As training sessions continued throughout the week, one truth became harder to ignore: these 3 puppies weren't ordinary rescues. They carried something strong: grit, instinct, a drive that seemed older than their scars. Darla began pulling Mason aside more often. "You ever consider putting one in the Navy K-9 program?" she asked. Mason blinked. "They're too young." "Not now," she said, patting his shoulder. "But someday. Breaker's got the mind for it. Coral's got the intuition. And that wild troublemaker," she jabbed a finger toward Riptide, "might just turn into a tracking genius." Mason didn't dismiss it. He only looked at the pups through a new lens, one shaped by possibility. Later one evening, after the volunteers left and the hall lights dimmed, Mason and Jazz found themselves sitting side by side in the quiet training room. Breaker rested at Mason's feet. Coral curled in Jazz's lap. Riptide sprawled across both their boots like a furry bridge. Jazz glanced sideways. "You're thinking about it, aren't you? K-9 work." Mason didn't deny it. "Breaker wants purpose. You can see it." Jazz nodded slowly. "They all do. They just need someone patient enough to guide them." Mason rubbed Breaker's ears gently. "I just don't want to push them too fast." "You won't," she murmured. "You're too stubbornly careful." He smirked. "Is that supposed to be an insult?" "Affectionate observation," she corrected. Silence settled between them, comfortable, unforced. Jazz rested her head lightly on the wall behind her. "I used to think certain beings are born with stories etched into them. Like their souls come with pre-written maps." Mason looked down at the pups. "And these 3? They're not following a map," she said. "They're drawing one." Mason didn't respond, but he placed his hand over Breaker's chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm beneath his palm. For the first time in a long time, he felt the ground beneath him stop shifting. And he wasn't the only one. Spring gave way to early summer before anyone realized how much time had passed. Warm winds swept across Jacksonville, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and ocean salt. The days stretched longer, brighter, softer. Brave Haven had become more than a shelter, it felt like a crossroads, a place where stories shifted direction. Weeks of slow, steady recovery had transformed the 3 once helpless German Shepherd pups into confident, spirited young dogs. Their bodies were stronger, their fur glossy, their eyes bright with purpose. Breaker had grown tall and steady, his stance firm, his movements deliberate. His limp had faded into little more than a faint stiffness after long days. Coral had blossomed into a gentle, intelligent companion, her once fragile frame now filled with calm strength. And Riptide, chaotic, wild, brilliant Riptide, had become the heartbeat of the trio, mischievous but sharp, always pushing the boundaries as if testing the world to see where it might bend. People began asking when the puppies would be ready for adoption. Darla fielded those calls with a knowing smile. "They'll tell us when they're ready," she'd say. "But don't hold your breath." Because everyone who worked at Brave Haven could feel it, these dogs were already on a path. The only question was where it led. One warm Saturday morning, Mason Ridge and Jazz Holloway arrived at the shelter together. Mason had a folder tucked under one arm. Jazz carried a small cooler stocked with water bottles, snacks, and 3 collapsible bowls. Darla spotted them from the office window and grinned. She stepped out, wiping her hands on her flannel. "You're starting today, aren't you?" she said. Mason nodded, patting the folder. "Evaluations. And field testing," Jazz added. Darla rubbed her chin. "You do know they're still puppies." "Program starts young," Mason replied. "If they're going to be considered for K-9 service, we need early markers." Darla leaned forward. "And you're ready to do this?" "Fully. This isn't just about training. You know that." Mason hesitated, only for a breath. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm ready." The 3 puppies greeted them with a flurry of movement. Breaker trotted forward calmly. Coral padded over and leaned gently against Jazz's leg. Riptide, predictably, launched himself at Mason with so much excitement that he nearly knocked the Marine backward. Mason steadied himself, scooping the wriggling pup into his arms. "Still subtle as a hurricane, huh?" Riptide licked his chin proudly. The evaluations began in the fence training field behind the shelter, a wide, grassy area bordered by oak trees and dotted with equipment, tunnels, ramps, scent cones, and a tire swing someone had tied between 2 posts. Jazz started with Coral, guiding her through a series of scent trails and obstacle weaves. Coral moved carefully, her instincts sharp. She was cautious but precise, a natural tracker with a gentle touch. "She's got a soft heart," Jazz murmured. "But a strong one." Mason nodded. "She'd be incredible for therapy support. Emotional work. Maybe even crisis response." Next came Riptide. Jazz barely finished setting the markers before Riptide launched himself into a run, weaving through the course with chaotic brilliance. He overshot turns, doubled back, barked at the cones, circled them twice, then suddenly nailed a perfect straight-line sprint right to the target scent. Mason burst into laughter. "He's unpredictable, but damn, he's gifted." Darla, watching from the fence line, hollered, "He's gifted at making me lose my sanity." Riptide barked back like he agreed. Lastly, Breaker stepped forward. Mason crouched down and looked the young shepherd in the eyes. "This isn't a test," he said softly. "Just show us what you want." Breaker's posture straightened. He sniffed the air, focused on the course, and moved with intention, slow, steady, methodical. He navigated obstacles with surprising confidence. When he reached the scent markers, he paused, circled, and pressed his nose directly onto the correct target. Not once did he falter. Jazz exhaled. "He has the heart of a service dog." "No," Mason said quietly, eyes softening. "He has the heart of a guardian." The remainder of the day moved in a steady rhythm, training, breaks, short walks, quiet evaluation. Each pup showed distinct promise, distinct strengths, distinct futures. When the sun began to dip, they gathered inside the shelter's small conference room, Darla, Jazz, Mason, and the 3 pups sprawled on the floor as if they belonged in every decision about their own lives. Mason opened the folder. Inside were 3 forms, early entry evaluations for the U.S. Navy K-9 development program. Jazz leaned forward. "This is the path you want for them?" "Only if it's what they're meant for," Mason answered. "Only if it's right." Darla cleared her throat. "You know these dogs aren't just cases anymore. They're bonded. To each other. To you too. And to this place." "I know," Mason said. Jazz looked at Breaker lying across Mason's boots, Coral curled near her thigh, and Riptide sprawled belly up under the conference table. "They're not just rescues," she said softly. "They're survivors." Mason took a slow breath. He reached down, rubbed Breaker's head, and whispered, "You saved a life before you ever wore a badge. Imagine what you'll do with purpose." Darla tapped the table. Then let's make it official. Jazz smiled. Tell me what to do. Mason slid the forms forward. We enter them. All three. Darla signed her name first. Jazz added hers. Mason signed last. When he finished, he looked at the three pups with a mixture of pride and something heavier, something earned. This isn't the end of their story, he said. It's just the moment everything shifts. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The K9 Development Center reviewed the applications, watched the evaluation videos, and examined medical charts. They sent a representative to Brave Haven, an older handler named Vaughn with a calm voice and a practiced eye. He observed the pups for half a day. Breaker impressed him with discipline. Coral earned his praise with empathy and alertness. Riptide nearly stole Vaughn's pen, then correctly tracked it across the yard after being scolded. Vaughn laughed for 5 straight minutes. Yeah, he said. He's a K9 candidate if I ever saw one. And so, in late summer, the letter arrived. Accepted. All three. Darla cried first, loudly. Jazz cried second, quietly. Mason didn't cry, but he went outside for 20 minutes and returned with suspiciously red eyes. The morning they left for the training base, the sun was barely rising. The pups stood beside the van in their new collared harnesses, Breaker steady, Coral calm, Riptide vibrating with energy. Jazz knelt and cupped Coral's face, kissing her forehead. Go show the world how gentle hearts fight, she whispered. Darla hugged Riptide, who promptly tried to chew her earring. You better make me proud, troublemaker. Mason knelt before Breaker. The pup leaned forward and pressed his forehead into Mason's chest, the same way he had the night he first slept without nightmares. Take everything you survived, Mason said softly, voice thick, and turn it into everything you'll become. Breaker's tail thumped. Then, with 3 soft nods from their humans, the shepherds climbed into the van. Doors closed. Engine started. Wheels turned. And the 3 small survivors who had once been thrown to the sea began the journey toward becoming guardians of it. Their story didn't end on the shore. It didn't end in the shelter. It didn't end in the pain they carried. It began in the moment they rose from it.